waiting for Superman last night. Any observations about the video? I must confess that the edition that I had and that I thought I brought with me was only 26 minutes. And Matthew bravely found this other version, which apparently was the original one, which was considerably longer than that. I think it would have been more bearable, and probably was certainly a better editing job was with the 26-minute job. But anyway, any overall comments about it, particularly as they relate to our concerns in terms of Catholic schools? Father Jason, you look like you're chafing at the bit. Well, the one thing that annoyed me about the video, there was no mention whatsoever of Catholic schools as a viable alternative. And you know, the truth of the matter is, it's the most viable alternative. I think another issue that comes out in there, they're very concerned about graduation rates. You know, that only 10% or 15% are graduating from high school. This may sound like pedagogical heresy, but I really don't care about graduation rates, because you can graduate a baboon. Does he know anything with a high school diploma? You know, I've met peasants in Umbria who graduated from 6th grade and know more history and culture than people here with doctorates. So simply having a piece of paper in hand doesn't prove that there's anything there. And what we discovered, for example, in New York City a couple of years ago, they were very concerned about the low test scores. And so what did they do? They didn't teach the kids better. They lowered the test score. So now 60% are passing the tests, whereas before it was only 40%. So you keep, you know, dumbing things down consecutively. And at a certain point you say, gee, isn't it wonderful? Everybody's doing well. And it reminds me of a mother who came into me years ago complaining that I had given her daughter a D in English. And she said, you know, my daughter, when she was in PS 42, you know, she was an English scholar. She wrote her first novel in 7th grade. Can you imagine? And, I said, you're concerned that she got a D, or are you concerned that she doesn't know English? So if I had given her an A, would you not have been here? She said, you're outrageous. So of course we know what the answer was. It was, she was concerned that the girl got a D. Welcome, Father. And so it's, you know, that's an interesting little phenomenon. And also, just by way of the, you know, the movement between systems, the last high school that I ran, we had 70% of our freshmen came to us from public junior highs. And if you want to talk about a problem of integrating people into a system, so it's coming from 8 or 9 years of disrespecting teachers, of parents bullying teachers and administrators to get what they want, already well on the path toward secular approaches to life and all the rest of it. Very, very, very difficult. And I'm involved in a conversation now with a pastor who's opening a school, a grammar school, and I was, you know, thrilled with that. But I heard through the grapevine that he was opening all 8 grades at the same time. And I said, I don't think you can do that, right? You need to do this incrementally. The schools that I have been involved with opening, we started K1 and 2 and then add a grade a year until you develop an ethos and an identity for that particular institution. And we're going to spend, you know, most of this session this morning talking precisely about Catholic identity. And the other point that comes out in the video last night powerfully in spades is the power of teacher unions. It's absolutely incredible, the clout that they have. And again, years ago in New York, when the Catholic school teachers were unionized, and I hate to say the problem of unionized Catholic school teachers started here in Philadelphia. But in New York, the Catholic School Teachers Union hooked up with the AFT. They were a wholly owned subsidiary of the AFT, who were the very obstacles to any kind of aid to Catholic schools. So they became bedfellows of the enemy. And to me, absolutely incomprehensible. But I think when we're dealing with the public, it's extremely important to highlight the critical importance of unions in any kind of educational discussion today. And that's generally not done. Bishop, yeah?
Well, another thing is that they measure their serious intentions by telling you how much they spend per student.
Sure.
Now, about 5 years ago, there was a study done comparing the cost for the administration of the New York school system to all the school systems of France. And the New York City school system had 7 times the number of people that the French did, and that the cost of the New York system was 10 times more expensive than the entire country of France. So that this notion about using money as a way in which we consider how we're really spending on students is a joke. They're spending money on administrators and all kinds of other people that are drawn into the administration who don't want to teach anymore. I mean, there was that one scene with the people that they can't put anyway in any school.
That's right.
And it cost them how many millions of dollars?
Sure, that's right. Yeah. Well, the parish high school that I went to at the Jersey Shore, it's an extremely upper middle class scene. The public school system there spends, I believe, $24,000 per student. The 2 Catholic schools, the grammar school and the high school, spend on average $10,000. And our test scores are higher than the public school. So we're doing it for half the amount and getting better results. And I think at times we've gotten bamboozled into the idea that if we're not, as the bishop said, spending lots of money, that somehow or other we're providing an inadequate education. And simply because money is being spent doesn't mean it's going in the right direction whatsoever. And in fact, in that same school district, the former superintendent had his house raided by the FBI 2 years ago because, as a matter of fact, he and his cronies had embezzled something like $25 million from the school system over a period of 5 or 6 years. So if you want to know where your tax dollars were going, that's another whole issue. If you had gotten one of the previous recensions of our schedule, you saw that it was scheduled for tonight a video called The Rule, and you notice its absence now. Any of you familiar with that movie, The Rule? It's about St. Benedict's Prep in Newark. And I actually, as a seminarian, I began my master's program in school administration with the monk who was newly ordained and from St. Benedict's. And we're in the same cohort going through the graduate ed program at Seton Hall. And so when I heard about the movie and it had gotten rave reviews, I was very excited about putting it into this program, because at a certain level, it's a great success story about how they took what had been a very thriving boys prep school where bishops and governors were the alumni, and then transformed it into something that is incredibly serviceable for the inner city. And so I was very pleased with that. And then, with years of experience in teaching, I knew I couldn't show the video without having seen it first myself. and I was extraordinarily disappointed. There is no indication whatsoever of any attempt at evangelization of Catholic identity. A lot of good talk about values, a lot of good talk about setting a high bar academically, discipline-wise, and so forth. But for all practical purposes, I mean, the religion curriculum in the high school does not correspond to the norms of the U.S. Bishops' Conference in any way. There is no explicit course in Catholicism whatsoever. There's a course in world religions. There's a course in the Bible, and some psychology courses that somehow have a spiritual or a religious component. So, but that's a good example of unfortunately, Catholic identity going out the window. Although they've got 8 monks in habit teaching, so there's obviously a visible presence of something that's there. But in terms of any kind of explicit work of evangelization, that's clearly not there whatsoever. So, any questions about any of that before we move into just a little bit of history and then explicitly on oh, and also I should give you now, I alluded to this yesterday, but about the very low levels of knowledge that we find in this present generation. And there's a wonderful book by Mark Bauerlein, who is one of the editors at First Things. And he wrote a book called The Dumbest Generation. Have any of you read it? It is more devastating than Bloom's Closing of the American Mind, okay? So in some ways, we see the book from 84 or 85, whatever that was, updated in 2015 or so. And these are 2 reviews of the book. And maybe it'll, I'm always amused when I hear senior citizens say, my grandchildren are so brilliant. I couldn't hold a candle to them. They know how to use that iPhone. They know how to do this. I said, could they tell you the date of the American Revolution? The answer, of course, is no. And so this is what is documented by Bauerlein here. These are 2. And then I mentioned also yesterday that we've all been treated to the statistics about the abysmal failures of public schools in the inner city, but are constantly told about how successful the public schools in suburbia are. And this is an op-ed piece from the New York Times from this past May. And it's called Guess Who's Taking Remedial Classes? And it's about the graduates of suburban public schools. And I believe that the figure is 78% of the graduates of suburban public high schools going to a 4-year college have to be taking some kind of remedial courses, either in reading or math or language arts or something of that nature. And as I said last night, with some of this community college teaching that I've been doing recently, I'm astonished at the incapacity of these students to read. Basic reading skills, just not there. And so when I teach a philosophy course, I actually go through the textbook paragraph by paragraph because they don't know what the paragraph means. And some simple things, for example, what's the main point of the paragraph? Well, because they have an undifferentiated consciousness, they have no capacity whatsoever to say, that's the main point. I gave them a sentence last semester. I said, tell me the main point of this sentence. My mother, who was 46, was hit by a car and died. My mother, who was going shopping, was hit by a car and died. What's the main point? Your mother was going shopping. No. Your mother was 46. No. No. Boys and girls, she's dead. That's the main point. Oh. And so, I mean, you see there's a huge problem here. And so this is the Times that's normally a great cheerleader for the teachers' unions and all the rest, but they, for some reason or other, were willing to pass on that bit of information. And then this is just a little lighthearted piece that I should have given out when Sister Maureen was here last night. She would have appreciated it probably. Bishop Kennedy has a great smile on his face for it. All right, just a little historical context for the endeavor of American Catholic education. The very first sentence of my education doctorate, doctoral dissertation at Fordham said this: the first school within the territorial expanse of what is now the United States was a Catholic school. And the dissertation advisor said, Father, that's a bit of an overstatement, an exaggeration, isn't it? Where would you get that idea from? I said, well, it's history. And he said, well, where was that school? I said, Florida. And he said, oh, now you have a couple of things in the mix here. Number one, the Anglo-Protestant view of American history. In addition to which you have also just an ignorance of history. At any rate, that first school was established by the Franciscans in Florida in 1606. And I had an interesting little experience with this fact a few years ago. And the three Floridians here will appreciate this, I hope. I was doing a teacher workshop at St. Paul's School in Jacksonville when Father Legeza was the pastor. And I was doing a teacher workshop and it happened to be Catholic Schools Week. And I had the student body mass for the beginning of Catholic Schools Week. And so I began the homily by reminding the children how fortunate they were to be going to a Catholic school. And I said, and by the way, can any of you tell me where the first Catholic school in the United States was? And hands were up all over the church. And I thought it'll be interesting to see what we get. And I picked a little fourth grade boy and he said, St. Augustine. I said, wow. He knows the history of his diocese, all right? And so that's the fact, though. 1606, the first Catholic school. And the opening of schools in all the Spanish territories was a pattern followed then in California and New Mexico as the Franciscans sought to educate the children of both the colonists and the indigenous population. The French exploration of the New World led to the opening of the first school for boys in New Orleans in 1722 by a Capuchin friar. The Ursuline nuns began a girls' school in that city 5 years later. And those French schools became prototypes of schools to spring up along the St. Lawrence River and in St. Louis, Kaskaskia, Mackinac, Detroit, Vincennes, and Maine, interestingly, where a Catholic school existed as early as 1640. In the British colonies, Catholics experienced relative freedom only in Maryland, as long as Catholics were in charge, and in Pennsylvania. And it was in those places that Catholic education began its development into the system that it is today. And the groundwork laid during the colonial period served as the foundation for the massive Catholic educational effort that would flourish within 50 years of the ratification of our Constitution. Now, much of what parochial schools became, and still are, came about through a series of events played out in New York City. The chief protagonist, or antagonist as some would see it, was Archbishop John J. Hughes, whose nickname with the Protestants at least, was Dagger John, because when he would sign a pastoral letter, he put the cross, but when it was printed, it came out as the form of a dagger. And since they didn't care for him because of his very in-your-face approach to things, his moniker became Dagger John. At any rate, Hughes was embroiled in a heated controversy over Catholic children and their education from 1840 to 1842. And his first complaint centered on the overt anti-Catholicism in the so-called public schools. Now, it's important, again, to put this in a historical context. There was no such thing as a secular school. All schools were denominational, right? Methodist, Presbyterian, Unitarian, Episcopalian, whatever. And, parenthesis, and all schools receive government funding, okay? Now, these public schools had a denominational coloration to them. And part of that coloration was not simply that they were Protestant, but they were overtly anti-Catholic. The textbooks were anti-Catholic. The Bible reading was always tinged with some kind of proselytism of Catholic children. And Hughes opposed this. When assurances were given that the most offensive aspects of the bigotry would be stopped, he next attacked Bible reading in the schools as a sectarian religious exercise unacceptable to the Catholic community. And interestingly, he was joined in the battle by Unitarians, Jews, other religious minorities, and atheists. Unwittingly, he may well have paved the way for the secularism that now prevails in America's state schools. On the issue of both Bible reading and prayer in public schools, I have, for a long time, had a position that sometimes surprises people. I'm adamantly opposed to both of them in state schools for a number of reasons. One, I would not want, well, I guess the first thing with prayer is whose prayer and what's it going to mean? For example, in New York State until 1963, there was the so-called Regent's Prayer, which was an extremely innocuous invocation of the Supreme Being, but valid only for monotheists and, frankly, only for Christians and Jews. So whose prayer is it going to be? And if it's going to be innocuous, what's the value of it? Thirdly, particularly in the contemporary scene, I wouldn't want a prayer to give the impression that we're baptizing the rest of what goes on in that institution the rest of the day, because it can lull people into the idea that, well, they do pray in the school, for heaven's sake. As a friend of mine says, you'll always have prayer in schools as long as there are tests. But I have an interesting, personal angle to it. My father, when the family moved from Massachusetts to Newark, he was in 4th grade, and they couldn't get him into a Catholic school. And so he went to the local public school where there was prayer, which was the Lord's Prayer every morning, and some reading of Bible verses. And of course, the version of the Lord's Prayer that they used was the so-called Protestant version with the doxology attached. And my father had been told by the parish priest that no Catholic could recite that doxology. And so my father dutifully stopped at "Deliver us from evil," while the rest of the class went on for "Thine is the kingdom." And at the end of the year, my father found himself kept back in 4th grade because the teacher said, there's something developmentally wrong with the boy. He can't learn the last line of the Lord's Prayer. And he had to go to summer school. Now, needless to say, when that line got tacked on as the embolism in the Mass, my father wasn't very happy. He said, I got kept back in 4th grade because you couldn't say it, now it's in the Mass. At any rate, you see, my point, though, is you don't want to use religion as a cudgel. And And I think that is very, very possible. And now, I mean, up through the 50s and the 60s, we could say that our culture here was a Judeo-Christian culture. That certainly is no longer the case. I mean, the pluralism, particularly in city environments, is so great that I don't know where you would even begin to start to try to find common ground in terms of a religious issue. At any rate, back to our friend Archbishop Hughes, his most notable achievement, though, was gaining for immigrants the right to operate and control their own schools. He was unsuccessful in obtaining public funds for those schools. Hughes went to the New York City School Board, and he said, we're opening a school, St. Peter's at Barclay Street, where Mother Seton was received into the church. He said, we've opened a school there, and now I'm applying for funding for our school, the way the Anglican school or the Episcopal school at Trinity has funding, and this school has funding. And they said, oh, and although he was an Irishman by birth, he knew the American law and Constitution very well. And they said, but those are public schools. And he said, but they're religious schools funded by the government. And if you are funding them, then you must fund us, which of course is the constitutional principle, okay? There's no need to fund any religious institution, but if the government chooses to fund any religious institution, it must fund all of them. It's a neutral principle. And they said, they had their little meeting, and then they said, the old codger is right. And so they said, these are not denominational schools anymore. They are public schools, and it was the so-called common school was invented. And the result was that Hughes was told there'd be no funding for the Catholic schools. And so, yes, we were free to operate those schools, but at our own expense. And that's the beginning of the no aid to Catholic parochial schools, is in that moment in 1842 with John Hughes. As a result of getting the no answer, Hughes then started to attract religious orders of women from Europe to come to be the low-paid staff for the schools. And we don't understand, perhaps, initially, the Catholic schools in this country were lay predominant faculty. In fact, very, very few religious, maybe some of the schools run by Jesuits had their own personnel, but certainly at the parochial level, 90% of the faculty were lay teachers. And so in some interesting historical fashion, we're back where we started, right? And perhaps we were interested in having religious on board for less than noble reasons, often enough, huh? It was cheap labor more than it was a desire to have sisters for the sake of having sisters. And any of you who do have sisters in your schools now and who have good nuns, you're very fortunate, but you'll be the first to say they're not cheap labor anymore, okay? As in many instances, you're paying more for the sister than you are for the lay teacher, which to me is fine. I'd pay triple to have a good sister in the school. But if we're using the argument that we want them because it's cheaper, that's not even accurate. And Hughes then abandoned his battle with secular authority, and that served as a further impetus for the establishment of a separate school system for American Catholics. And the famous line from one of his speeches, "The days have come and the place in which the school is more necessary than the church." And I use that in my opening line for my homilies on Catholic schools when I go around to parishes. And I said, does that line astonish you? Who could say that? Well, as a matter of fact, it was said by the Archbishop of New York almost 175 years ago. And what was his point? That if we lose the children, we have lost the church in this country. He understood that in a very, very profound way. Now, as I mentioned last evening, not all American bishops agreed with Hughes on either the necessity of Catholic schools or the desirability of state aid. Archbishop John Ireland of St. Paul uttered cautious but clear statement of desire to utilize public schools. And the so-called Poughkeepsie Plan was a compromise effort to have Catholic children partially under ecclesiastical jurisdiction and partially under state control. And his suggestions along those lines, though, were vehemently attacked by many of his brother bishops, most notably, for example, John Lancaster Spalding, the Bishop of Peoria. Peoria contended, like Hughes, his words, without parish schools, there's no hope the church will be able to maintain itself in America. Unlike Hughes, though, Spalding recoiled from the thought of any kind of governmental assistance for parochial schools. And this afternoon, when we talk about some financial issues and prospects of various forms of government aid, this will come back for a discussion. And while the first Catholic school operated on the continent as early as 1606, it took more than 2 centuries for those institutions to be organized into anything resembling a system. And it was, of course, the Redemptorist, naturalized American citizen, John Newman, that accomplished that feat right here in Philadelphia. As the 4th Bishop of Philadelphia, Newman established a diocesan board of education with clerical and lay representatives from every parish in the diocese. So people who think the consultation of the laity began with Vatican II in 1965 are very ignorant again of our history. So you had a board of education that consisted of clergy and laity. And through the body of advisors, and due to his own personal drive, parochial education prospered in Philadelphia and became a united, coherent system, making Philadelphia a model for the nation, and John Neumann the father of parochial schools in America. By 1892, Archbishop Patrick John Ryan had appointed a Philadelphia priest to full-time work as a diocesan superintendent of schools. The first diocesan superintendent of schools was here in Philadelphia. The commitment to Catholic education continued to grow, and under Cardinal Doherty, who reigned gloriously from 1918 to 1951, a unique system of free Catholic high schools flourished. And what was a priority for the ordinary was expected to be a priority for his clergy, because pastors unwilling to open parish schools were threatened with removal. The strong organizational beginnings in New York and Philadelphia spread throughout the country so that American Catholics could boast of the largest privately sponsored school system in the world by the 1950s and 1960s. And then the bottom dropped out. And we want to look at just our beginnings here and look today, this morning, at the issue of Catholic identity. What makes a school Catholic? I'm a great believer in what I call niche marketing. And it seems to me you've got to identify a target audience. And in order to identify a target audience, you have to know what you have to offer that no one else in the market has. And to me, there are 2 things. One, superior academic performance. And you're going to hear a pitch at lunch today about the classical model of education. And secondly, what cannot be reproduced anywhere else, even in the best performing schools, whether they're government-sponsored schools or privately owned schools, is Catholic identity. And one of the serious causes of our downfall in the 60s and 70s was a waning, and in some instances almost total destruction, of Catholic identity. And since personnel is policy, the Catholic identity issue has to start with the administration and the faculty. And in 1996, Pope John Paul gave an address to the International Office of Catholic Education. And he spent 3 or 4 paragraphs talking about faculty. He says, "These then are the teachings which each day on the average school grounds form the teaching faculty. It is of supreme importance that these educators, who have come of their own accord to offer their services in a Catholic institution, or have been recruited by the administration of the school, have a precise vision of a Christian education based on the gospel message. It is a sacred duty for all to bear witness individually and at times communally to their faith. Some of them are happy to conduct the periods of religious education or catechesis. Each one, in the discipline he teaches, will know how to find the opportune circumstance to have youth discover that science and faith are two different yet complementary readings of the universe and of history. If the constitution of the teaching faculty is one of the serious problems for Catholic education in the maintenance of its identity, the questions of the formation of future teachers and periodic renewal programs for instructors, both on the cultural and religious plane, are more important than ever before. The Church rejoices at the efforts undertaken in this field. Catholic education must be outstanding for the professional competence of its teachers, the witness of their strong faith, and the atmosphere of respect, mutual assistance, and gospel joy which permeate the entire institution. And so he's talking about, number one, hiring policies. What do we understand? What are the first questions that we ask? When Father Dan was beginning his headhunting for a headmaster, he asked me to come up with a series of questions that ought to be presented to candidates, which I will go over some of them with you in a bit. But they all zero in specifically on the faith commitment of the individual, his vision of what it means to be an Catholic educational leader, how he would intend to, in his turn, hire faculty that have the same vision, and then how that gets translated into the educational environment and how that's shared with parents. So the first is the selection process. And then there has to be an ongoing formation process. I mentioned last night when we had 80% of our teachers religious, that formation process occurred co-naturally. It happened in the convent community room. It happened in their own internal workshops in their congregations. That's not the case anymore. And when we talk about one of the distinctive obligations and privileges of a priest in Catholic education is precisely the ongoing Catholic formation of the faculty. And so some kind of monthly, it doesn't have to be a 4-hour lecture on the catechism, but some element of ongoing liturgical education, biblical study, church history, helping faculty integrate their various subject areas into, or rather integrate religion into their various secular disciplines. So, and you can see that this is precisely what John Paul had in mind. In '98, in one of his ad limina addresses to bishops from Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, the Pope says, "The greatest challenge to Catholic education in the United States today, and the greatest contribution that authentically Catholic education can make to American culture," notice again the point that Benedict made yesterday, it's not simply an internal affair, it's what can we do for the culture itself, how to redeem the culture, as it were, is to restore to that culture the conviction that human beings can grasp the truth of things, and in grasping that truth can know their duties to God, to themselves, and their neighbors. In meeting that challenge, the Catholic educator will hear an echo of Christ's words, "If you continue in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free." The contemporary world urgently needs the service of educational institutions which uphold and teach that truth is that fundamental value without which freedom, justice, and human dignity are extinguished. And there he quotes himself, as he was fond of doing, Veritatis Splendor. But again, notice, the faculty are key, their personal formation, in turn, their formation of the students, and then the students, and Sister made that point last night, becoming what? disciples in the marketplace. He goes on, the respect which Catholic elementary and secondary schools enjoy in your country suggests that their commitment to transmit moral wisdom is meeting a widely felt cultural need in your country. The example of bishops and pastors who, with the support of Catholic parents, have persevered in leadership in this field should encourage everyone's effort to foster new dedication and new growth. The fact that some dioceses are involved in a program of school building is a significant sign of vitality and a great hope for the future. And at times we in the Northeast, so often here, unfortunately, about closures, mergers, and all the rest, we fail to realize that the latest statistics show nationwide, 68% of Catholic schools have a waiting list. Now, they ought not to have a waiting list because we ought to be building schools to accommodate those students. But there's a demographic shift that has occurred in the Southeast and the Southwest in particular. Catholic schools are booming, and at times, again, that depresses us who live in this environment, who for the most part only see the other side of the picture. I also know how much you value the dedication of the many laymen and women who sometimes at great financial sacrifice are involved in Catholic education because they believe in the mission of Catholic schools. If in some cases there has been an eroding of confidence in the teaching vocation, you must do all you can to restore that trust. And here again, the importance of what can the priest offer in this process? Helping our teachers understand that a Catholic school teacher, being a Catholic school teacher, is not a job, it's not simply a profession, it's a vocation. And raising that awareness in them and reinforcing that on a regular basis. When I was a high school administrator, during Catholic Schools Week, inevitably we would have one day for teacher appreciation. And one of the things I did in the first school, I put out a list of the entire faculty with, next to each teacher's name, the salary the teacher was getting with us and what the teacher would get down the road in the local state high school. And when I did that, some of the teachers said, "Father, why are you doing that? That's embarrassing." I said, "No, it's not. Because in a materialistic culture, dollars speak." And so kids would go to a teacher and say, "Mrs. Heike, you're getting $30,000 at Bishop Kelly High School, and if you went 2 blocks away, you'd get 65. Why?" Oh, guess what? That becomes a teachable moment, huh? Teachable in a variety of ways, not least of which is, man does not live by bread alone, the bread that's money, right? And secondly, it says a great deal about the commitment of the teacher. Now, I'm here because I can do something here that I can't do 2 blocks away. And I think that's another point to emphasize with teachers, that there are trade-offs in life, right? When I was teaching in the Graduate School of Ed at St. John's University, my first semester there happened to coincide with the very unfortunate Catholic school teachers strike in the Archdiocese of New York. And I continued to operate school during the strike, as a result of which I had my tires slashed every day of the strike. Great witness of Catholic school teachers' commitment to Catholic education. At any rate, I had one of my graduate classes one of those evenings, and I made some kind of snide remark about the teacher strike, and one of the teachers was quite offended by it. And she said, "Well, we have a right to a living wage," and she went through the whole story. I said, "Well, that's true." I said, "However, you can't get blood from a turnip. And I can raise your salary by 10% or 20%, but where is that money going to come from? Invariably, it comes from raised tuition. And we have the statistics. Every time we raise tuition 5%, we lose 10% of our student body." And I said, "So we can give you a couple of raises, but eventually, guess what? You're not going to have any job at all because there are not going to be any kids here." And so one woman raised her hand and she said, "Well, I was a Catholic school teacher, and then I became a public school teacher. And I thought, here it comes. And she said, and let me tell you, she said, I worked in the Diocese of Brooklyn for 3 years in a parish school. I loved it. And she said, and I got my contract renewed for another 3 years. And then I got a call from the New York City Board of Education saying there was an opening. And I was able to go in there, this is 25 years ago, getting $75,000 a year to be a 4th grade teacher. And she said, so I took it. I said, so first of all, you violated your contract. You had already signed with the principal. Yeah, well, she said I could go. Well, of course, who wants to keep you on board if you don't want to be there? Anyway, she went to a school on Staten Island, which for all practical purposes is still suburbia, okay? So we're not talking about a jungle scene. She got there, 4th grade, and the second day of class, kids were misbehaving, and one boy was particularly recalcitrant, and she said, see me at 3 o'clock for detention. He said, yeah, right. She said, now it's 2 days detention. 4th grade. And so at 3 o'clock, she remained. She didn't see him. She waited for 15, 20 minutes. No kid. She goes out to the parking lot. Her car is surrounded by 4th grade boys with broken bottles who are using them to destroy her car. And she said, what are you doing? And they said, and now you're next, B. 4th grade. She runs into the school, gets the principal. He said, oh my, what did you do to them? Why would they react this way? So he comes out, and there are the boys still there with their broken bottles. And he says, huddle, guys, huddle. Now, Mrs. Smith is new here, and she, maybe she said something. She dissed our buddy. We don't like it. And we're going to slash her. He said, let's all calm down, go home, we'll get up tomorrow morning, it'll be a new day. She said, I got in my messed up car, went across the Verrazano Bridge, went to that parochial school, said to the principal, sister, I'd like to come back. My sister said, your job was taken a day after you left. And she said, you're right, Father, there are trade-offs. And I think at times we don't make that point with teachers. If a Catholic school teacher comes into our building with a lesson plan, 4 limbs, and virginity, she'll be able to walk out with 4 limbs, virginity, and having fulfilled the lesson plan. And that ought to be worth something to any teacher. And I think at times we shy away, we get so intimidated by the financial issue that we're afraid to say, yeah, there's a sacrifice involved, but guess what? There's something else that you get out of this that you're not going to get in other places. I'm always reminded of that scene in Man for All Seasons when Richard Rich is having his conversation with Thomas More, and Thomas More, in his usual tongue-in-cheek style, says, well, Richard, what do you want to be when you grow up? And he said, well, I was thinking about being a teacher, but I don't think I want to do that anymore. And he said, why don't you want to be a teacher? And he said, who would know? And Moore says, well, let's think about that. You would know, your students would know, and God would know. Not a bad audience. And I think, again, that's something that we can provide in the ongoing spiritual formation of our teachers. The realization that this really is a vocation. I mentioned yesterday that it's interesting to see Papa Bergoglio's approach to Catholic education as he reflects on it from his own experience of Catholic schools as a student and also later as a teacher in high schools. He gave a letter, or rather he wrote a letter which was revealed later to a Salesian in Argentina. He was educated by the Salesians. And here are 2 paragraphs, his reflection on what went on in that school. School life was a whole, W-H-O-L-E. I was immersed in a way of life prepared so that there wouldn't be time to be lazy. The day passed as an arrow without time for one to be bored. I felt myself submerged in a world that, although prepared artificially with pedagogical resources, had nothing artificial about it. The most natural thing was to go to Mass in the morning, as well as having breakfast, studying, going to lessons, playing during recreation, hearing the good night of the Father Director. Each one was made to live different assembled aspects of life, and thus created an awareness in me. Not only a moral awareness, but a sort of human one, social, play, artistic. Said differently, the school created, through the awakening of the conscience in the truth of things, a Catholic culture that was not at all bigoted or disoriented. Study the social values of living together, the social references to the neediest. I remember having learned there to deprive myself of some things to give to persons who were poorer than I. Sport, competence, piety, everything was real, and everything formed habits that altogether molded a cultural way of being. One lived in this world, but opened the transcendence of the other world. It was very easy for me then in secondary school to do the transfer in the psychopedagogical sense to other realities. And this simply because I lived well the realities lived in the school, without distortions, with realism, with a sense of responsibility and a horizon of transcendence. This Catholic culture is, in my opinion, the best that I received at Ramos Mejia. Everything was done with a meaning. There was nothing without meaning, at least in the fundamental order, because accidentally there were gestures of impatience by some educators or little daily injustices. I learned there, almost unwittingly, to seek the meaning of things. One of the key moments of this learning to seek the meaning of things was the good night that the Father Director generally gave. Sometimes the Father Inspector did it, when he passed through the school. In this connection, I still remember, as if it was today, a good night of Monsignor Miguel Raspanti, who at that time was the inspector. It was at the beginning of October of '49. He had gone to Cordoba because his mother died on September 29th. On his return, he spoke to us of death. Now, when I am almost 54, I recognize that little evening reflection was the point of reference of my whole subsequent life in regard to the problem of death. That evening, without feeling fear, I felt that I would be dead one day, and it seemed to me the most natural thing. And he goes on to talk about a simple life lesson already in elementary school. Then he says, I learned to study in the school. The hours of study in silence created a habit of concentration, of a quite strong control of dispersion. Always with the help of professors, I learned a method of study, mnemonic, technical rules. Sport was an essential aspect of life. One played well and a lot. The values that sport teaches, in addition to health, we already knew. In study as in sport, the dimension of competition had a certain importance. We were taught to compete well and to compete as Christians. Over the years, I have heard some criticisms of this competitive aspect of life. But curiously, they were done by Christians liberated from this pedagogical aspect, but who in daily life slaughtered one another for money or power and did not compete as Christians. A dimension that grew a lot in the subsequent years to the one spent in the school was my capacity to feel good. And I realized that the base was set the year of boarding school. They educated my sentiment there. The Salesians have a special ability for this. I'm not referring to sentimentalism, but to sentiment as a value of the heart. Not to be afraid and to say to oneself what one is feeling. Education to piety was another key dimension, of virile piety, appropriate to the age. In piety, devotion to the Most Holy Virgin merits a special mention. They impressed this on me with fire, and as much as I remember, also my companions. And the recourse to Our Lady is essential for life. It goes from the awareness of having a mother in heaven that takes care of me to the recitation of the 3 Hail Marys or of the Rosary. The Virgin remained and could not go out of our heart, and so on. Closely united to love and devotion to the Most Holy Virgin, Virgin was a love of purity. In this connection, I believe together in Don Bosco's preventive system, there's a very great misunderstanding. I was taught to love purity without any sort of obsessive teaching. There was not obsession in school. I found more sexual obsession later in other educators or psychologists that shows ostentatiously a laissez-passer in this regard, but which deep down they interpreted behaviors in a Freudian key, which saw sex everywhere. And he goes on to talk about various other aspects of life in the school. And you see what he's describing there. It's something that's within the reach of all of us. And there are benchmarks, if you will. These are measurable realities. In his talk to Jesuit school graduates, I don't wish to be too long, but I'd like to address a specific word also to the educators, to the Jesuits, to the teachers, to the workers of your schools, and to parents. Do not be discouraged in face of the difficulties that the educational challenge presents. To educate is not a profession, but an attitude, a way of being. To educate, it is necessary to come out of oneself and to be in the midst of young people, to support them in the stages of their growth. Put yourselves by their side. Give them hope, optimism for their journey in the world. Teach them to see the beauty and goodness of creation and of man, who always has the imprint of the Creator. But above all, be witnesses with your life of what you communicate. And here, of course, he's echoing Paul VI in Evangelii Nunciandi. Modern man doesn't listen much to teachers, but if he does listen to teachers, it's because they're, first of all, witnesses. An educator, whether a Jesuit, a teacher, a worker, or a parent, transmits knowledge, values with his words, but will be incisive for children if he accompanies his words with his witness, with his coherence of life. Without coherence, it's not possible to educate. You are all educators. There are no delegates in this field. Hence, collaboration in the school can and must be the catalyst, the place of encounter and convergence of the entire educational community, with the sole objective of forming, of helping to grow as mature, simple, competent, honest persons who are able to love with fidelity, who are able to live life as response to the vocation of God and their future profession as service to societies. And then he actually hits the Jesuits themselves. To the Jesuits, I would like to say, it's important to nourish their commitment in the educational field. Schools are a precious instrument to give a contribution to the journey of the church and the entire society. Hence, the educational field is not limited to the conventional school. Encourage yourself to seek new, non-conventional ways as well. Now, I mentioned that laundry list of questions for hiring, in this instance, an administrator, but you can make the adjustments. Question 1, what do you understand by the expression practicing Catholic? Are you a practicing Catholic? Did you attend Catholic schools, elementary, secondary, college, graduate? And that question is asked on the principle of nemo dat quod non habet. Are you married in the church? Do you have children? Do they attend Catholic school? If not, why not? To me, it's bizarre that a Catholic school teacher would have his or her children in a non-Catholic school. How can that be an advertisement? Ecclesiastical documents speak of a Catholic head of school as a leader in faith development. How do you see yourself fulfilling that role? Scenario: a child is presented for enrollment. Its parents are cohabiting, or gay, or remarried. How would you handle each situation? Of course, this is going to come more and more to the fore. You may remember a couple of years ago in the Diocese of Orange, California, an episode exploded where the Norbertines, who run that wonderful St. Michael's Prep in Silverado, I guess. But they also have a parish with a school. And at the school, a gay couple approached the principal, a lay woman, about enrolling a child. And she immediately called the pastor. This was a significant time ago, before these things were as commonplace as they've become. And the pastor said, hold them off for a bit and let's you and I talk. And so they came up with a pastoral plan. And again, I don't think we ought to be punishing children for the sins of parents, but there also need to be some kind of clear parameters here. And so they came up with a program. The pastor and the principal met with the couple and said, your son is welcome to come to, I believe, St. Simon and Jude school. However, there may never be any kind of public demonstrations of affection between you. There can be no discussion of the relationship that's here, because this will give scandal. And for 2 or 3 years, it worked fine. And then for some bizarre reason, at a school Christmas concert, the two guys decided to start kissing each other. And the whole thing blew up in everybody's face. And so pastor and the principal said, little Johnny's got to go. You're punishing our son. And the priest said correctly, no, you've punished him. You chose to do something that we had said was beyond the pale. But there needs to be a policy in place. Right? This can't be an ad hoc decision, because then it's going to look arbitrary, capricious, and also, in this day and age, the possibility for litigation. Question 7. It's come to your attention that a faculty member belongs to a political or social organization opposed to one or more teachings of the church. What will be your response? 8, how do you see yourself in relation to the parish at large, the pastor, and the civil community? 9, what's the purpose of a Catholic elementary school? 10, how do you plan on conducting faculty development in terms of faith matters and academic dimensions? Who are your models for Catholic educators? Have you read Newman's idea of a university? What do you think of it? Do you think it has any relevance for an elementary school? What do you understand classical education to be? What does the adjective Catholic add to the concept? What's your vision of a Catholic classical curriculum for an elementary school? What would you look for in hiring a teacher? How would you present, that is, sell, a classical curriculum to a middle-class parish community? What kind of experience do you have with K-8 children? Are you comfortable working with a predominantly or exclusively female faculty? And what's your notion of discipline? It's 20 questions. Any comments about those questions, I guess? But I think you see, I hope you see, how that really goes to the heart of all of the Catholic identity issues. It touches on every aspect of Catholic life. Now, about 5 years ago, in our Catholic Education Foundation, as I was going around the country doing teacher workshops, it became apparent to me that there needed to be some kind of organized method of assessing Catholic identity. And we came up with an instrument to do that. And it's an instrument that everyone involved in the educational process participates in. The administrators, the faculty, the support staff. And initially, some principals said, you mean like cafeteria staff and janitor? Yeah, because everybody in a Catholic school is a teacher of the faith. The way you slosh that macaroni and cheese onto the plate on Fridays, right, says something about your idea of your mission in that school. But there was another reason, because one of the priests who worked with me on this project had, as a seminarian, worked in a Jesuit prep school that was, for all intents and purposes, rather observant of its Catholic identity. But interestingly, he discovered that the most popular man on campus was the old man who was the janitor in his 70s. And he thought initially, well, a lot of these kids probably don't have grandpas hanging around, and that's what they're looking for, and the old man fulfills the role. Great. Well, as Rob got ordained and ended up staying at the school as a diocesan priest in the Jesuit school and started hearing kids' confessions, he discovered why the old man was popular. because after school every day in the locker room, he gave boys free condoms. And so the breakdown in Catholic identity was not the mission statement of the school. It was not the administration. It wasn't the faculty. It was the janitor. And that's why it's so important that everybody be included in the assessment process. And the instrument is broken down into various components. Obviously, a general one on the demographics of the school, one done by the administration, and then one done by every faculty member, and then a separate one for support personnel. And what's interesting about it is that in some way, simply asking the questions already sets expectations. And what we have found in the Denver Archdiocese, a young pastor called me asking if he could, I should say, by the way, we started doing this only for high schools. And then when pastors found out about it, they said, can you do an elementary school version of it? Which we subsequently did. And this young pastor called and he said, I've inherited a school that is Catholic light. There's nothing bad going on, but there are some weak individuals, weak links in the chain, and there are some people that I think I need to get rid of next year, but I'd like to do this assessment. And after that assessment is done, we collate all the data, put it all, it comes through that, what's that, monkey, what's that? What is it? Survey Monkey. We collate all the data. You can tell I'm not in the tech mode of life. But we collate all the data and say, here are the strengths that we have discovered or that you have told us about. And here are areas that we think need improvement. And so after the survey was done at this school in the Denver Archdiocese, the pastor said, boy, you found all the stuff that I've been looking at for the past couple of months. And so he attended the monthly faculty meetings, which I would encourage every priest to do. Because otherwise you're getting rumors about things, right? But he said to the teachers in February, we completed the assessment, and I hope that by next month, I will be able to present you with your contracts, those that we're inviting back. And after the session, 3 teachers came up to him together and said, by the way, Father, if you're thinking about giving us a renewal of contract, we don't intend to come back. And he was smiling interiorly, and he said, I said, well, I hope that means you're going to give the Catholic Education Foundation $10,000 bonus because we saved you 3 lawsuits, because they were precisely the 3 that he was going to disinvite. And so that goes to my point about just raising the issues already puts the school on a particular course. And then there's a follow-up that's possible, which is, in phase 1, you've told us what you see about yourselves. Now, phase 2, we come and visit you, and we observe what we have seen here. And then it's done like a middle states visitation, usually about 3 days. Visit classes, interview faculty members, interview parents. If there's an alumni association, if there's a school board, if there's of course, the pastor, or if there's a board of pastors or whatever. And then we write a report. So we have phase 1 a secular accreditation process are already used to doing this kind of a thing anyway. And so, but as a matter of fact, I find it very useful to do them in tandem because it says these two go together. In fact, at the end of August, I have to go out to the LA Archdiocese, a high school. By the way, in the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, all 51 diocesan high schools must participate in this survey. When now Archbishop Hebda was Bishop of Gaylord, Michigan, all of the schools of the Diocese of Gaylord were required to participate in the process. And everyone has found it extremely, extremely helpful. But I'm going to a high school that completed phase 1 late spring, and I'm going there now at the beginning of the new school year to do a 3-day visitation. And I've done a couple of the high schools already in LA with the visitation. And it's amazing, I was saying to some of the priests last night, I, as a stranger walking into a school, the very first thing that always strikes me, if I walk in a building and kids say, "Hi, Father, how are you? Welcome." It's the first indication Catholic identity is in some way present. You walk into some other places, it's like, "Huh? Who are you?" I had one administrator tell me, "Well, they weren't very friendly because, you're a stranger." And I said, "No," I said, "but you see, in the Catholic community, no priest is ever a stranger." I said, "It's ironic. I walk the streets of New York all the time, and CEOs and hookers and drug addicts and cops say, 'Hi, Father.' But going into a Catholic high school, you don't get greeted because you're quote a stranger, right? There's something off. There's something badly off in the place, okay? Anything else on that identity assessment? And then there's an article written by a guy named Arthur Kennedy that appeared in Logos in 2012, where he quotes Christopher Dawson on Christian education. And I've had this in my stable long before the bishop was coming to this workshop, so it's not to create brownie points. Dawson says, "The vital problem of Christian education is a sociological one. How to make students culturally conscious of their religion." Culturally conscious of their religion. What was the thing that we had going for us up through the late 50s, even a bit into the 60s? Was there was a Catholic culture. Some people refer to it as a Catholic subculture, or even nastily a Catholic ghetto. But it wasn't, huh? I remember, my boyhood in Newark. Every significant human event that I performed was done on church property. Academic, social, athletic, religious. That was our life, was there, and our life together as children, as children of a neighborhood, and that's still the case in some places, and I think probably still in Philadelphia in some ways. People didn't say I came from the Roosevelt section of Newark; they said I came from St. Rose's. The Jews in the neighborhood said I come from St. Rose's. But there was a culture that was there, and religion wasn't an appendage, it was life. And I think this is one of the huge losses that we've experienced in the past 30 years, is the religion becoming compartmentalized, huh? He says, continues, "Otherwise they will be divided personalities with a Christian faith and a pagan culture which contradict one another continually. We have to ask ourselves, are we Christians who happen to live in England or America? Or are we English or Americans who happen to attend a church on Sundays? There's no doubt which is the New Testament view. There, the Christians are one people in the full sociological sense, but scattered among different cities and peoples. But today, we mostly take the opposite view, so that our national cultures are the only culture we have, and our religion has to exist on a sectarian subculture. Thus, the sociological problem of Christian culture is also a psychological problem of integration and spiritual health. This is the key issue. We must make an effort to achieve an open Christian culture, which is sufficiently conscious of the value of its own tradition to be able to meet secularist culture on an equal footing. No need for us to have an inferiority complex, right? We actually have, and this isn't said in a triumphalistic sense, it's ought to be said in a very humble self-awareness. We have something that nobody else has. And because we have it, there's a burden on us to share that with other people. And if we don't, the problem is ours, not theirs. I worked very closely for years with a rabbi. We co-authored a couple of books. And one day, his wife said to me, when Leon and I were talking the other night, I said to him, do you think Father Peter prays for, and Bishop Kennedy knows the rabbi I'm referring to. Myra said, Leon, do you think that Father Peter prays that we become Catholic? And he said, oh, I'm sure he does. And she said, well, what do you think about that? And he said, well, knowing what Father Peter believes about being a Catholic, he would be the worst anti-Semite on the planet if he didn't pray for us to become Catholic. In other words, if you believe that you have something, there's a need to share that. And we as Catholics have not simply a catechism or a Bible, we have an entire way of life that's a culture. And experiencing that culture is something that's vivifying, it's enlivening, when it's done properly, when it's done well. So it's not the series of do's and don'ts, but it's the way we live as Catholics. There's just been a revival of Fiddler on the Roof on Broadway. And, you know, what's the Tevye's great hymn to tradition? It's the way we live, all right? So it's not the 45 minutes on Sunday morning. It's Catholic all along the line. And it's an unconscious or even pre-conscious way of conducting our lives. I don't stop and say, now how does a Catholic react when someone honks his horn at him, all right? All right? No, it's co-natural, right? It's the way I behave. It's because I've been trained in this manner my whole life long. And so it's, in essence, as natural to me as breathing. And this is the way I operate. And that's what we want to be aiming at with our students. And what's the real purpose of a Catholic school? The first high school that I was called upon to lead was a complete mess. Academically, religiously, discipline-wise. And as many of you have experienced, you get a reputation in the priesthood for being Father Fix-It. So you get sent to all the dumps, and you fix it, and you leave, and your successor undoes it in 15 minutes. But you get sent to another place to fix. At any rate, I was 28 years old, and I brought the 500 high school students, in quotes, into the gym for an introductory assembly. And first of all, I had to be essentially a lion tamer. Faculty were doing nothing whatsoever to enforce discipline or order in the environment. And so finally we got it quiet. And I began with what I thought was a throwaway line. I said, this high school exists for one reason and one reason alone, that everyone here would become a saint. And a kid from the bleachers yells out, I'm no saint and I don't want to be. Well, I was stunned. And I said, you, center court. That you're not a saint, that's clear. That you don't want to be, that's a big problem, mister. And let me tell you, if you're standing by that statement, you leave this gym right now, do not pass go, do not collect $200, stand in front of my office, and I'll give you your walking papers to go down to the public high school 2 blocks away. And anyone else who subscribes to his philosophy form the procession behind him. I didn't know it was the captain of the football team, who ended up becoming a great friend, a daily mass attender in the school, right? But that's the purpose, right, of a Catholic school, that everyone become a saint. And we ought not to be shy about saying that. And in fact, if we don't say it, we're frauds. Either we're frauds in what we're offering, or we're frauds by not telling the truth in what we really want to offer. And the amazing thing is, people come on board with that, right? That actually becomes a rather attractive possibility. I came across a transcript of one of the radio addresses of then Father Fulton Sheen from 1938. And the title is Patriotism. And we know he was a great flag waver, but he did this in an interesting kind of way. And one of his ideas on Catholic forms of patriotism was precisely that we would offer the Catholic distinctiveness to the entire process. And he says, about halfway through, oops, we Catholics are taking religion so seriously in reference to our country that rather than see God perish out of our national life, we conduct 7,900 elementary schools and 1,900 high schools, employing 58,900 and 16,700 teachers respectively. And figuring on the basis of public school costs, we save the taxpayers of the country an immediate $1 billion building program, and for maintenance about $139 million every year. Every cent of this money comes out of the pockets of Catholics. And why? Because we believe that the 2.1 million children in Catholic elementary schools and 284,000 in Catholic high schools have a right to know the truth that makes them free. There it is, huh? They have the right to know the truth that makes them free. And notice again, his point, which we saw with several of the popes. What do we have to offer to society as well? That's part of the formation of a good citizen occurs in our institutions. Another great article from Wall Street Journal, why tough teachers get good results. The importance of discipline. You can't have education without discipline and consistency. And here again, this is an area of oversight for a priest. If you're involved in the school environment on a regular basis, you ought to be able to see what goes on in terms of the discipline in the school. Is there chaos? Chaos, remember, God makes creation from chaos, not the other way around. People can't learn in a chaotic environment. And if there is discipline, is it fairly meted out? Is it Christian discipline? Is it aiming at self-discipline? I do a lot of student-teacher evaluations, ironically for an evangelical college, and it's amazing. And they're all to public schools, and I'm amazed, really amazed at the chaos that exists. I was in a 4th grade classroom last spring, 17 children in the class and 4 adults, and there was still chaos. One adult saying, "Sit down, Johnny. Mary, no, you can't get up now." Chaos, absolute chaos. Kids hitting each other, kids not ignoring the main teacher, ignoring the teacher aides. And he's saying, how could anybody learn in that environment? It would be impossible. An article from New Oxford Review from 2014 on the fundamental evil of fragmentation. And what he talks about here is a unified approach to teaching and learning. One of the big downsides of contemporary education is fragmentation. If you're a college student and you go to your English professor and ask him some question about a Shakespearean sonnet, he'll invariably say, "Oh no, that's not my field. You want to go to Professor so-and-so who teaches Shakespeare." And so you go to the Shakespeare professor, and the professor says, no, I just do plays. I don't do the sonnets. That's somebody else. Right? No, knowledge is a unified whole. Everything is connected, interconnected. And that's part of the whole. I mean, when the church invented the university system, what was it? Universitas turned toward the one. These were all spokes in the wheel that all converged on the center, which is the truth, who is God in Christ. And then the Archbishop of Armagh, Primate of all Ireland, Eamon Martin, gave an address to the Catholic school teacher colleges of Ireland a couple of years ago. And he again sees the schools as integral to evangelization and talking about the various aspects of Catholic education, again, contributing to the holistic development of the child and the overall contribution to society. And then finally, there's another article from Logos from 2013 by David Foote called History, Secularity, and the Problem of Catholic Seeing. There is a Catholic way of seeing things, right? And that's where we come up with the idea that Catholicism is more caught than taught. Yeah, I could teach a child the names of the 7 sacraments in 10 minutes, unless there was some kind of intellectual problem there. But to know the experience of the sacraments, all right, or to list the 10 commandments, and those things are all critically important to do, right? But that produces a particular way of looking at reality. And I've received a lot of converts into the church over the years, and invariably, including our friends from last night, they will say, it's taken me 10 years to react to a situation in a Catholic way without going through a process, a mental process that says, what does the church teach about this? How does that, right? Connecting the dots. This is something that happens by the lived experience, which creates a vision. And it's like the mistake that people make when they say, faith is not seeing. No, faith is not seeing. Faith is seeing with the corrective lenses provided by the infused virtues of faith, hope, and charity. We see reality, but we see it differently from other people. And we would say we see it correctly because we are viewing it with the eyes of Christ. So those would be some issues related to Catholic identity. Questions, observations? Doable?
It's done before.
That's right, it was done. We did it for 150 years and great with success. And some of us are old enough to have benefited from that approach. Right? Okay, well, let's take 15 minutes and we'll come back for the priestly presence in the school.